Hello everyone, hey, I'm Bob Allen from Homestay Bank in Jefferson. Got Eric Snodgrass here today from Nutrien Ag. Really excited about having Eric here with us today. So we're trying something new. Instead of having a large meeting and having everybody come in, everyone's schedule's busy, so is mine, so is Eric's. We're going to try something new. We're going to record a version here, put it on YouTube, and we'll text it out to you. So hopefully you have a chance and you can watch it at your convenience, you know, whether you're sitting at home or maybe in a tractor or somewhere else, or wherever you can have the opportunity to watch it. So like I said, we're really excited about having Eric here. Eric, do you want to kind of give us a little bit of your background and what you do for Nutrien Ag?
Yeah, so first part of my career, I was a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Illinois. I started a couple of small companies where we were looking at how weather was impacting a lot of different things, primarily insurance. And then from there, got kind of hooked up with a guy in town that had another small company that was deep in ag. I'm like, let's do this. And so basically we formed a newer company, and Nutrien came along and said, we really want that tech. And I was mid-career at the university, and they said, you want to come with us? And I said, sure. So I miss the university, but I like doing this, so I get a kick out of it.
Well, that's great. Well, if it's okay, let's just dive right in. I've got some questions. You know, a lot of our listeners out there, including myself too, are involved in agriculture, and of course it's you know, the end of March here, getting into planting season, and you know, what are some things you're seeing, I guess, here as far as West Central Iowa? You know, we've been really dry the last couple of years, but what are some things that we can expect going into the next 30, 45 days? Yeah,
you know, it was funny. About 3 weeks ago, I was in Daytona Beach, Florida. There was a conference down there. I met this great farmer, from West Central Iowa, and we're about ready to fly back home. We're sitting next to each other, and I said, what do you think about the drought right now? I said, because I look at the maps and I see the numbers, and I'm like, it makes me want to go like, holy cow. He's like, I don't really care. I'm like, what do you mean you don't care? He goes, you know what? Keep it dry until I'm done planting. And he says, and that's still going to be, you know, my insurance states plus, you know, just timing. He goes, this is 3 weeks ago. So he was talking about it being maybe 2 months before he was even going to do anything. He says, I'll really worry about this if it's still there June 1st. I said, that's pretty level-headed, because
that's a good point.
Spring rains can undo all of winter sins. I've used that phrase forever, and it's one of those things where right now we just look at the maps and we start to see where there's drought, and it just has us overly concerned that we've not seen this much drought at this point in spring since the inception of the Drought Monitor. So we're like, what's going to happen? Because it looks terrible. But the reality of it is that I was telling a group this last week. I said, you know, we have got this big storm system coming through this week we're talking. And I said, if we get like 3 of those in a row, no one will be talking about drought anymore. It'd be like, oh, well, the Central Plains just had these 3 big systems. The soil moisture came back up. And now we're like, can you make it stop so I can get in the field? So it's one of those things where we get to this point in the spring, and we really just need to be thinking about what will this look like come July. And I think that's the big thing to think about at this point. But you're right. Drought will be the #1 concern, I think, with folks until we're not talking about it anymore.
You know, you mentioned the Drought Monitor, and I'm a faithful follower. Thursday morning, 8 o'clock, you know, to log in and see what the Drought Monitor is doing, and it's unbelievable, you know, to look at that. And pretty much most of the United States is in a drought or some form of a drought. And is there now? I like to use the different tools on there as far as the year-by-year comparisons and the slider tool, for example. Is there an analog year, you know, that we could look at? I mean, I've been kind of looking at different years. You know, I think back to 2012, for example, and actually we're drier now, according to in a much more wider area than 2012, and that was probably our most recent significant drought. So, in your observations, is there an analog year that we could probably look at? Yeah,
the analog year is last year, and that's we were coming out of a La Nina like we normally do going into summer. You kind of lose the strong La Nina signal. The drought area is very similar, although it was much worse in the southwest to the Four Corner states, that area. And you know, it was a classic example of how tight our limits of predictability are. What I mean by that is that, you know, at this point earlier in March a year ago, every long-range forecast model said, well, where the drought is going to stay. Right. And then where it's wet, it's going to stay wet. So right now we're really wet in the mid-south. We're really wet in the eastern Corn Belt. And we're dry. You know, you just get west of the Mississippi and just keep getting dry. Well, anyway, last year, Come mid to end of March and April, it just rained like mad in the Central Plains. And there were some good timely rains. Even though we went back into drought into Iowa later in the season, we had moisture at some point. And I'd look back at that and go, every model just blew it. So you say, what's an analog? And I say, well, 2021. And then people ask, can we get a repeat? You know, can we have a 2021 rain event in the spring? Because you go talk to anybody in the Central Plains throughout the whole of the Cotton Belt, from Texas, South Carolina. I mean, they're all happy because it broke cool and we had rain. Yeah, and I said, well, if you want to get a repeat of that, these things have to occur. And right now, I don't see them occurring. So I can't use the only analog on the drought monitor as a good, useful tool for this year. But you're right. 2012's drought, it was in Texas, but not across the West like it was. It was dry in the Southeast, really dry in the Southeast. And that's one of the great things about the Drought Monitor and one of its shortcomings, right? So the Drought Monitor is based on the Palmer Drought Severity Index. That's one of the many things that goes into it. And it's out of the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Fantastic school, great thing, I love it. But that particular tool doesn't tell you about the most important form of drought in Iowa, and that's flash drought. That's the kind of drought where all of a sudden it goes hot and dry for 10 or 15 days when the crop's pollinating. Yeah. And it didn't matter what you had up to that point because the crop is taking the water out and then you're blasting it with heat. Sure. And it just can't respond fast enough. So we're doing a lot of research and studying flash drought to know how do we predict that? Because those years where the yield just really plummets seems to be those years where, okay, we have some drought problems a little bit, but then boom, it just hits all of a sudden.
Sure, right.
So, yeah. It's a great tool, though.
All timing too. You know, if it's when those flash droughts occur, and sometimes they're probably isolated too. You know, like we've seen in.
Well, even in 2012, it still storms. Yes, right? I mean, there are people that caught. There's a guy down the road from me that caught 2 of those storms. His neighbor hit 83 bushel an acre. He was 212.
Yeah, and that's something.
And he got to sell that corn. Oh, it's crazy.
Yeah. You mentioned La Nina. Mm-hmm. It seems like we've been in La Nina for quite some time. Are we still there, or do you see us shifting into El Nino, or how's that transition look? Is it is it going to be a slow transition, or is it going to watch out and the spigot's going to turn on and we're going to have a lot of water that we'll have to deal with? Yeah.
So the trick about studying El Nino or La Nina is that the ocean temperatures, which we like to look at, they're just the symptom. Okay, what you're seeing there is that the atmosphere has made a change, and it allows for either the cold water to upwell by giving us really strong trade winds, or you have the opposite where the trade winds have slackened off or they've stopped or reversed and the warm water sloshes back. So when we look at those ocean temperature maps, it's really just telling me what the trade winds are doing. And we care about the trade winds because whatever happens right on the equator, ultimately that momentum and heat gets transferred either to the North or South Pole. Okay, so when there's a La Nina, the transfer of momentum is very strong from the Himalayas through Japan. Okay. So what that means is the jet stream's screaming there, and then by the time it gets to us, it just gets loopy and slows down. And we have drought expansion in winter. Sure. If it's there in summer, we have the same problems. So historically, it's correlated with drier summers. When there's an El Nino, the whole thing loosens up a bit, and the jet stream goes a little bit faster, and we tend to have this great flow out of California to Maine. We get plenty of rain. Now, sometimes it's too much, like 2019, that was coming off of an El Nino winter, and boy, it just wouldn't quit. So right now what we see is that the ocean temperatures in March made a bit of a resurgence back toward cold. I didn't predict that. I actually thought it'd be fading from December on. Came back, almost unpredicted. But generally speaking, you lose the ocean temperature contrast as you go into a summer anyway. Okay. So almost always they fade into summer. They reach their peaks, right there in the middle of winter. In fact, that's how they got their name. I don't know if you ever knew this, but El Nino was named by Peruvian fishermen. Oh. And how it got its name is that when the warm waters would show up, all the anchovies they fish for would go away because they want the colder water. So the timing of the peak of the warm water was always around the beginning of the new year. So for them, being Roman Catholic, it was right around holiday Christmas. So they called it Jesus. The warm water was Jesus coming. El Nino capitalized, El Nino is baby Jesus. Now La Nina, which is the opposite, is just what scientists called the opposite of El Nino. So they almost always reach a peak then, and then they fade. We've had 2 of them now. And historically, there's a few times there's been a third. Okay. Now, if you use the US models, our best one is called the CFS V2, Climate Forecasting System Model version 2. Okay. That model does not want to let this La Nina go anywhere. It wants to keep it all summer. It wants to keep it into next fall. But the only people that are happy about that are the people that live in the southeast, because La Ninas, you know, what they do is they tend to alter hurricanes a little bit, but they prevent drought in the southeast because hurricanes more frequently get to the U.S. Now, it's funny, they have a love-hate relationship with hurricanes. Bring in the weak ones all day long. Right. Don't give me any strong ones. Right. El Nino years shut hurricane seasons down. So, but then you have the risk of them going into drought. So you see, they're always balancing one out with the other. Now, every other modeling agency in the world has this this La Nina fading to neutral by spring. Okay. So we're all sitting here going, why is the U.S. model the outlier? Right. And what is it that it's picked up on, and is it erroneous or is it legit? And I could spend weeks looking at it and still probably not come up with an answer. Really? So yeah, it's just, I'm good. I hate to say it, but I think with this current La Nina, it's going to be, let's see where it gets to by mid-April, because we're right now in what we call the spring bearers. So we're recording this on the equinox. Right. So today the sun's rays are now going to be more direct in the northern hemisphere. That's going to change the temperature dynamics of the northern hemisphere. The jet stream responds. Once I see how it responds, I'll know what that La Nina is going to do. But it's going to take about 30, 40 days to see it. So that was a really long-winded answer to your short question, but if you feel like we don't know, it's because we don't. Right,
yeah. Long story, we should pop some popcorn and just wait here and more to come basically in the next 30 days, and whether to see if it breaks or not. Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned the CFS model. I know in watching your YouTube presentations, you also have talked about the European model too. Mm-hmm. And can you kind of explain the differences, and also too, I'm sure there's probably some years where some models are probably more accurate, you know, and there's some years are not, and it's kind of what you're seeing right now so far to this point. Which one is the one that has been most accurate?
Well, have you ever heard the phrase that with any model, garbage in is garbage out, right? Okay.
Exactly, sure.
So what the Europeans figured out, and this was kind of a global effort, so it wasn't just like the Europeans figured it out, they were just the first to implement it. They implemented a better technique of data assimilation, which means their garbage that goes into theirs is a little better.
Sure.
So while they're running the model, they're feeding in the freshest and newest data, versus the way we do it in the US with some of our models is that we stop everything, that's the current state, run it from there. That's part of it. Okay. The European model is also higher resolution, and it has, now when we run these models, we don't just run them once, we actually run them with what we call a control run and an operational run. So those are two. And then we run them a whole bunch of other times with little different changes to see if they still give you the same simulation or if they diverge. If they all give you the same simulation with a little change, then you know that the solution's good. All right. The Europeans do that 50 times, we do it 30. Oh. So they just have a better modeling system in place. So the European model tends to perform better statistically than the US model. But I mean, I hate to say it, they're all not good, right? We can trust them out, 6, 7, 8 days. And by the way, the most brilliant people in the world work on it. But we're trying to predict the future behavior of a nonlinear chaotic fluid. So it's actually not predictable. But we attempt to try to see how things shift around. So most folks are actually pretty satisfied with our, even at like 7 to 10 day forecast. I mean, we're able at least to tell you, when's like this big system coming in next week. We started talking about it last Saturday. Right. Not this one, but the one before. Like, hey, I'm seeing this, get ready. Yeah. And so, but I couldn't tell you exactly when and where it was going to do what. So our flagship model in the US is called the GFS. So the Europeans have their ECMWF model. It'll run out 15 days. It has a secondary part that'll run out 45 days, and a third seasonal model that'll run out 7 months. Okay. In the United States, we have a massive suite of models, several of them. Some that run just 60 hours, some that run 16 days. We have a couple that'll run out several months with day-by-day forecasts. So we take all of our stuff and assimilate it. They have one system that they rely on. But the reality of it is that, I'll give you some numbers. 3-day forecast accuracy is at 98%. It's pretty good. Okay. The 5 days about 85%. The 7 days about 80%. The 10 days 50-50.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's
wow.
for predicting a point.
Wow. So
it's 50-50 right now.
So to even, I mean, thinking of to go out 30, 60 days, or even through a whole crop year, it's just really not, there's just no way to really.
And I'm ashamed to say that there are companies out there that tell you they can do that, because it's not how, we're at a great university today, right? Sure. I'm telling you, you go talk to that atmospheric science department and ours and all of them, we would just like shake our head like, I can't believe someone is selling people this stuff, because it's not possible. It's
not even possible. Okay, well, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So I got to ask, I mean, is it for you in your career, is that kind of challenging because it changes so often, or does that, or as actually probably keeps it interesting though too, from the standpoint of, you know, really anything can happen the next 10 days?
It does. What helps us with getting that 10-day forecast, or even up to 15 days more accurate, is I'll take all those 50 different model runs, and usually when you average them, it gives you a pretty darn good solution. So that's why when we look out there at week 2, I don't tell you your day-by-day highs. I'll say, look, week 2 looks wet because of this, or it's going to look like 5 to 10 degrees above average because of this. Not, oh, it's going to be 93. You know, we just can't do that.
Yeah.
You know, and you talk about my career, yeah, it's a new story every day, and sometimes you wake up and you're like, I swear last night I said this, and then I get up in the morning, I'm like, whatever. But usually those kind of things are happening always out there at that 10 to 15 day horizons. And people are really forgiving about it. You know, I'm appreciative that, you know, people don't really give me that hard of a time. But, you know, what I expect, by the way, by the time I retire, is I expect us to be talking about the 3-week forecast the way that we talk about the 10-day forecast now.
That's
I do.
Exciting. Yeah.
I think that, and what's helping is data collection. We just have more of it, better modeling systems, the computer's getting faster, so we can assimilate it all faster and project. Plus, we'll have more years of data in history to compare to, which is that analog technique you talked about. So it's fun, but
yeah, that's exciting, and I'm sure the technology is just getting better and better every year too. So.
But there's a limit. It will never get. It's funny, real quick. We discovered the limit back in the 1940s. So they asked, there's a famous scientist. His name is Edward Lorenz. He's kind of the father of chaos theory. They asked him to write a little paper on limits of predictability with weather systems. He says, easy, it's 21 days. And it was funny that he was so just nonchalant. It's like, no, it'll be 21 days. But what he did to do that was he traced backwards. And you can't find the origin of a weather system. It gets absorbed into the background flow 21 days. That's the farthest we've ever, you know, so there's a weather system that's, you know, Iowa State today, and I look at the origins of that and go back in time, I might be able to measure it back 10, 15, 20 days, but the longest we've ever seen is 21.
Really?
Yeah, so if we can't figure out where it came from, that's going to be as far as we'll go. So it's a great bit of work. And we've, by the way, we've republished his results like once a decade since the 1940s, and everybody comes up with the same thing.
Wow, so that's interesting. So with that being said, I guess I got to ask, one of the questions I wanted to ask is, you know, and we're past the crop insurance date, you know, as far as us as producers, you know, making decisions, but we can still, kind of depends on our policy, but we can still make decisions on hail and wind and those type of things. And, you know, we've had, and I'm sure you're aware of this, in Iowa, we've had some kind of wild weather, I guess I would say.
Even this year?
Starting
mine 2020.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it kind of seemed like it started, you know, on August 10th to 2020, the day of the derecho, that went 700 miles across the Midwest. But then, you know, December 15th, we had tornadoes. And then just here recently, again, you know, a couple weeks ago, unfortunately, we had some more tornadoes come through. So, you know, as a percentage of severe weather, I guess, is there any way that you have a feel whether we may, as a percent of normal anyways, would we see a little, you know, potentially a little bit more or less than normal?
So that's what's important. That's a different style of forecasting.
Right.
So what we were talking about was like predicting the weather on your farm. You know, now we're looking at, hey, what's the chance this year of being above or below average for whatever weather metric you're looking at? So I'd answer that in two ways. Victor Gassini, he's a tenured faculty member at Northern Illinois University, brilliant scientist. He studied the last 42 years of tornado frequency. And he didn't do it with reports. You can't do it with reports because reporting standards have changed. There's more people to see them. So he looked at it in an entirely different way and basically discovered that Tornado Alley is kind of shifting east, right along the Mississippi River Valley. So the state of Iowa, over the last 40 years has trended up in tornado frequency.
Sure.
The worst spot is right around Memphis, just for if you're putting a mental map together. But anyways, it's right there on the Mississippi. So that's one thing. Last year we had a huge ridge that sat over the Northwest, and we had terrible weak flow for most of our severe weather season in Iowa. So we were, for most of last year, down. It was down on severe weather. In fact, hail reports for the country were below 50% of average. Do not expect that again. That was such a far outlier.
Yeah.
So we start to look at a few different things this year. And the thing that what typically happens in summer for us is that if we get a ridge that sits over like the Southwest, the flow comes over the top of it, and it comes right out of the Northwest across, well, comes out of the Dakotas, goes right through Iowa into Illinois. And we call that Northwest flow. In summer, Northwest flow initiates or helps to propagate squall lines. And that is our broadest and widest and most destructive storm type, simply because of its size. I mean, tornadoes are terrible, but they're tiny.
Right.
And hail swaths generally, they don't cover counties. They hit,
Yeah.
So this is a year where I think that, based upon some of the current evidence, that we're gonna start off with a risk in the central part of the United States of having some early season heat, drought issues, and a ridge there. But it appears, based off some things, that it might slide over the Four Corner states. And if it does, that's one of those years where we have it feels like two entirely different seasons, and all of a sudden it just flips over and it goes. I mean, you think about the end of 2021 where we were begging for moisture, and then it stormed like mad. I mean, some places picked up a foot of rain.
Yeah.
And it was just, all it took was a tiny shift in that whole pattern, and we got it. So I look at the history with the increased risk of severe storms. I look at the fact that we've already been able to, since December, by the way, that December 15th event hit 50 million acres. If there would have been a crop in the ground, I hate to say it, but no one would have been talking about August 10th, 2020 anymore.
Right.
That would have been so much more expansive.
It was a strange day.
Oh yeah.
I guess, it was.
I flew home over it, and it was the roughest flight I've ever been on in my entire life. I was in Sioux Falls, flew home to Chicago, and I'll never forget. Anyway, so I would just say that this is going to be a year where we're going to go back to either our normal or above normal risk.
Okay.
The faster that La Nina fades, I think the quicker the transition north with severe weather is going to be.
Okay.
So if you let the European model tell you what's going to happen, that transition is going to go quicker.
That's good to know.
Yeah, I would not go into this year uninsured, or any year. No, I would not. So,
another thing, I guess, was last year. I know in West Central Iowa we experienced very minimal timely rains. We had really pretty wonderful crops, I guess, all things considered. And a couple things I hear, talk to a lot of different people, and I know just my own observations too. It didn't seem like it was real windy summer. Right. It was hot and dry, but it wasn't really windy, so we didn't have like that convection oven type of impact. But then also too, of course, we had the fires out west, and there was quite a bit of haze, I guess. Yeah. So I guess specific to the haze, to the wildfires, it seemed like we're having more and more. Obviously, it probably correlates back to our drought monitor too. There's a lot drier conditions out west, but does that haze have any impact to our weather? I mean, as far as, just maybe share some thoughts on that, I guess.
Well, we studied it, and I looked specifically at the month of July, and I wanted to know how much sunlight was reduced by the wildfire smoke. So what we measured was, we wanted to look at the difference between direct sunlight and diffuse sunlight. So there are a few sensors around that we got some data from, plus we took the smoke data, the optical depth of it, and basically arrived at about 15% reduction in direct light. So we end up getting an indirect. It still comes in, but we've stopped the direct light. So we then looked at some papers that suggested that when that occurs, it can also keep your max temperatures down anywhere between 2 and 7 degrees. So we got hot, but we never really broke through that low 90s. Right. And we can, West Central Iowa can get to triple digit whenever it feels like it, but it just didn't get there. And it was interesting, you mentioned about the wind and the humidity, because the farther east you went across the state last year, we looked at humidity in July and August. The eastern side, almost the eastern half of Iowa last year, its relative humidity was up about 6 to 8%. And I walked some fields. Now, I was over in Cedar Rapids. when I did this, but it was in the middle of a long stretch of no rain. But I walked the field just as the sun was coming up. I was soaked with dew, and you could look at the base of every one of those corn plants, and they're just a little wet, you know.
Yeah.
And so I was talking to some guys at Nutrien, and I'm like, I think this is keeping this crop. And I was like, if you get a rain, they were worried, like, is this going to be our worst yielding year ever?
Right.
And then it busted all the bins when it was done. And so we wanted to know what caused that. And it's funny, the smoke took a little bit of the heat off, and then the dew was helpful, and then the rains in August were tremendously helpful. Now, the temperature decrease, that was very back of the envelope calculations. We actually don't know. That's hard to know, but it was just like, this seems to be what you'd get if you took the equation and you reduced the direct by that much. But they also wanted to know if it impacted soybeans, because soybeans, you know, they're a very photosensitive plant. If they weren't getting that direct light, did it peel back some of the yield? But you can't measure that. There's no way to know.
There's no way to know.
So we need to study smoke a lot more, is what I'm saying. I think that most of the publications I've been able to find have been published in India. And I don't know what to do with them. Their smoke is coming from pollution. I mean, it's the Ganges River Valley. It's all, you know. So anyway, yeah, we need to look into that a lot more, because we actually were able to measure from actually going all the way back to 2018. Some of those fires will put smoke clear into the North Atlantic. That's how far that stuff can carry.
It was a long way. It just like it covered such a large area.
Yeah. But you know, if I'm an Iowa farmer, if I'm an I-state farmer, and I see smoke like that, that generally means that the worst conditions, the heat, isn't over us. So those really red sunsets tell us the West is burning, and unfortunately, at their expense, we tend to have the benefit. So we have questions: is that going to happen in 2022? Because it seems like it happens every year now.
Yes, right. It does seem like that. You know, so does I've got to ask too, you know, Dr. Ellen Taylor, you know, and is served the state of Iowa and Iowa State University for many years, and has done a phenomenal job for the university, and he's, you know, as the last few years have talked about this 89-year drought. And you know, if you take 1934 to 1936, what are those time frames? You know, going way back, the time frames I know my great grandparents and grandparents had always talked about. You know, that puts us right now basically here. We're on the edge of that. So what can you just talk to us a little bit about that? I guess about the 89. You know, a little bit more about it, or if, what your opinion on that too is?
Sure. So first of all, a ton of respect for Dr. Taylor. I mean, to be honest, he pioneered a way for me to do this kind of thing. So I have a ton of respect for the man. And I've only met him in passing once, and I'd love to take him out to dinner and talk with him. So about the 89-year drought cycle. So I actually listened to he had a recorded lecture on it. Yeah, and I wanted to listen to it, and I thought it was very interesting. So general idea is we have actual physical measurements from 1847. And then the next big drought was 1936. And before that, he did a lot of examination of like tree rings and things of that nature, and looked and just kept seeing this cycle. And he tied that into some sunspot cycle stuff as well. And he's just saying, well, it seems to be, you know, that there'll be another event sometime between now and 2025. And I don't think that he, based upon his lecture, is saying that this is a guaranteed thing that happens every 89 years. And what I did, because I was curious, was I went and got all of that precipitation data, at least going back to the 1800s, and I wanted to take the data set and decompose it. What that means is you got all these, I wanted to know if there's a cycle to it. And so I used 4 different techniques to decompose the time series. The most advanced is called what we call principal component analysis. The simplest was just even looking at moving averages. And I couldn't find it. Now, that's what good science does. Someone tries something, I'm like, well, let me see if I can find it, and we'll have a conversation. So I couldn't find it. In fact, when you look over the last, I mean, it doesn't matter how far back you go, but you go back over the last 70 years, the state of Iowa, during April to October, the trend, that does, it bounces, but the
Sure.
trend is up about 4 inches of rain during the growing season. And we've also seen a tripling since our radar data era, so 1980 to present. We've seen a tripling of the frequency of the heavy rainfall. It's 2 inches or more a day. So that was all published by a group of universities, and I saw it and I'm like, I want to prove that. So I just got different data and found the same conclusions. So the 89-year drought cycle. First of all, it's important to know that the atmosphere doesn't have an agenda
Sure.
or a memory. So, and Elwin would say the same thing.
Sure.
What I mean by that is that it's not going 89. We're almost there. I'm going to wait, and he knows that, and he would say that. He's a brilliant man, and I respect him a lot. My issue with it is that I'm finding a lot of people giving a tremendous amount of weight to sunspot behavior and the prediction of weather. And this is why I don't do that. So I cannot find peer-reviewed publications that would support it. I can't actually find a peer-reviewed publication of the 89-year drought cycle either. So I would go looking like, well, someone has to have researched this because it has a huge impact on the economy. Elwin wrote a paper, but kind of published it as a loose article that the public could read, which is great. We need to do that.
Right.
So anyways, the sunspot issue. We have a really cool cycle in sunspot activity. There's an 11-year cycle, there's a 20-year cycle, or 22-year cycle, and there's even a longer one on top of that. And we go through these grand solar minimums and maximums of sunspots. And basically what happens is you get little spots on the sun, little. You could fit Earth inside of it, but they're cooler. And when you have those, you have a whole lot more activity leaving the sun. But the question we have to ask is how much total net energy, especially in the photoactive range, visible light, is that actually changing? And the very good news is the changes are about 0.5 watt per meter squared. Now, for everybody else, that's in the noise.
Sure.
The sun, if you put a square meter up next to the sun at Earth's distance, it gets about 1,370 watts per meter squared. So the little fluctuations, they cannot be used to account for drought, temperature. You just can't do it. So if there are first order effects on your weather, like changing ocean temperatures, El Nino, La Nina, then there are second order effects like there are global wind oscillations. In other words, the net flow of the atmosphere, it just changes. It has an ebb and flow to it. If there's a third effect and a fourth effect, that's where you put the sunspot stuff. Okay. So in other words, I cannot look at that and correlate it to anything to say, nope, this year is going to be a drought year because of that.
Sure.
What you can do is you can say, well, there's a La Nina right now. We have low atmospheric angular momentum. We've got cold water in the Gulf of Alaska. There's drought already in place. And we're in a grand solar minimum. So this gets added
to all those other factors that...
These are the factors.
Yeah.
That is a background thing that it doesn't come even onto the same stage as these things. So I had to tell a farmer this last week. I said, if we have a drought in 2025, that's the 89 years from 1936. I said, I'm sorry, but that's a coincidence.
Sure.
And I think Elwin, I don't know how long it's been since he's spoken on it or talked about it, but I'd love to just sit down and talk with him about it. Because like I told you, brilliant man, and he's a phenomenal speaker, and he knows the field. I mean, he got me good a few years ago. We had a La Nina year, and I had bit fully into it, just dying. I'm like, this thing is not going to last. I think this is going to fade fast. Somebody interviews Elwin. Elwin's like, all La Ninas have different flavors. You need to watch out for this one to stick around. I'm like, no way, bud. You got it wrong. And guess what? We had La Nina all summer long. And I'm like, Elwin Taylor, you got it. Fine, I understand. You've been around the block way more than I have. But I was a little younger and more naive and thought I could actually predict things. So yeah, but that's my short version of what could be a whole graduate level course on the topic.
Sure, I bet there is. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more to it. But yeah, I appreciate you talking about that. So I got one last question before we go today. And growing up on the farm and listening to my grandparents and great grandparents, and there's all these old farmers' tales and stuff like that. I love them, and for many of you out there listening, you've heard me talk about them. I guess my favorite one is, once you have a fog event, 90 days later, it seems like there's a moisture event. And I think it goes back to, before we had the internet and National Weather Service and those type of things where we had the information. And I think, when it's foggy, I think you used to write it down in the barn or something like that. And then, I mean, and they had no other way to really to kind of predict or project and look out in the future or anything.
Yeah, so they looked at those.
So they looked at those type of things, and I keep track of those, and I think for fun and so anyways, I wanted your take on that, and like, is there anything to it, or
there are hundreds of these.
I know there are,
great.
and they're fun. I think too.
I'm actually writing a book about them. It's a book where I hear these things, and I'm like, well, let's just see if there's. Most of them are. What's the word? They're self-fulfilling.
Sure. Right.
So, for example, if it's February or January, and you have one of those massive, super thick fogs, okay, it's because usually you've warmed up and there was snow on the ground, it melted, and well, 90 days after that, you're in mid-spring.
Yeah.
So it's going to rain.
It's
like that.
Going to rain in May. Yeah.
And some of them go, some of them are like 90 days plus or minus a week. I'm like, well, that's easy. If you give me a 14-day window, I'm pretty sure it's going to rain. But the two things, while the two things are not correlated, but the reality is that 90-day window puts you at the peak of your wet season, the wet time of the year. In Illinois, when the cicadas come out, I forget I think we always say it's like 90 days after the cicadas, you're going to have your first frost. But that's just normally because when the cicadas come out, it's about 90 days away from your average first frost, and the woolly worm forecast, the groundhog, of course, is just fun tradition. But the worst of all of these is there's a guy up in Canada. I can't remember the town, but every May. This is going to be coming up in a few weeks, but every May, the whole town comes out. All the news reporters, and they videotape him. He sits on his front porch and he chews a mixture of something, I don't know what, but I've been told there's like seaweed, all sorts of stuff. And then he sits there in his little rocking chair, very, looking like he's really contemplating the world. And what happens is he gets up after a while, and like everybody goes quiet, and he spits it. And what they say is that he spits it and he like analyzes the trajectory. And from that, in a few moments, he will just gets up in front of the camera and says, this is what's going to happen this summer. Usually what he does is he speaks in such broad, vague terms that everything he said, one of those things happens.
Potentially happen.
But the reality of it is, I don't care what the technique is. If someone could accurately forecast the entire summer weather pattern, you should never tell anybody. You should go to the Chicago Board of Trade, and it's like we do this woolly worm I don't know if you guys do it in Iowa. They do it in Illinois, and everybody's like, "Well, look at the woolly worms. They're, the brown woolly worms. It's gonna be really mild winter." And I'm like, "Well, Noah studied that." But what's funny is there was a TV personality that used to do this forecast, and she would go, "Oh, look, we got all the woolly worms in. Here's all the pictures. We've analyzed it." And she says, "This year, this is what you should expect in Illinois this winter. It's going to be. We're going to have bouts of really cold weather. We're going to see ice. We're going to see rain. We're going to see snow. We're going to have this big mid-January thaw." And I'm like, that's just every winter in Illinois. Like there's no information. There's
nothing unique about
that. That's right. But I just called my grandma and talked to her on the way in here. She'll see that, not knowing or caring, and she'll be like, "Judy nailed it. We had all that snow in early March when and I'm like, "Grandma." So it's fun. I love it. If we didn't do that, my job would be so boring.
Yes, right.
So
absolutely.
I love it. Yeah.
I think
keep writing those down.
I think most of us in agriculture and farming, would disagree that, and it's a little bit connection to our past, I think too, and so anyways, they're like
they're mostly founded in real events. It's just we've just observed them by looking at these variables because we didn't have atmospheric sciences is a young science.
Right.
I mean, it's very young. This university, my university, we didn't even have programs until you got through the 70s.
Right.
So where were we before that? We were in the military, and then we didn't share any of that information. So, it's a new science.
Right.
So that's great.
Very good. Well, Eric Snodgrass, thank you very much. Yeah. I appreciate you joining us today, and appreciate you and Nutrien Ag for what you do for all of us, agriculture, everybody involved in agriculture, and everyone that's interested in the weather too. And like I said, just really appreciate you taking time today and sitting down and sharing with us some of your thoughts. And also too, want to take this opportunity. This week's National Egg Week too, so I want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for all that you do, and to provide a good, safe, high-quality food in many different ways to all of us, but just appreciate that. And also, please stay tuned for any future series that we'll have coming out too. So look forward to hearing some feedback and what you thought of this. And once again, thank you.